Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the most unexpected icons of the Astra Militarum, Minka Lesk. She didn't start her journey as a legendary commander or a genetically enhanced super soldier. No, Minka began as something far more fragile, far more human, a Whiteshield. That term might not mean much to some, but to those who know, it carries the weight of tragedy, desperation, and quiet defiance. Whiteshields are the youngest recruits, often little more than children handed a lasgun and pushed into the meat grinder of war. They are the last line when everything else has failed. And Minka? She was the last of them, the last Whiteshield of Cadia. What makes her story stand out isn't just where she came from, but what she became. In a universe where heroes are often born from gene labs or chosen by divine providence, Minka Lesk was forged in the mud, the fire, and the endless bombardment of the Cadian front lines. No sacred relics blessed her rise. No divine visions guided her hand. She had nothing but her will to survive and her stubborn refusal to die quietly. And somehow, against every odd the galaxy could throw at her, she didn't just survive, she rose. When people talk about heroes in the Imperium, the names that echo across the stars are often those of primarchs, inquisitors, or saints bathed in golden light. But Minka Lesk carved out a name without divine favor or mythic ancestry. She became a living reminder that the Astra Militarum, in all its brutal, grinding relentlessness, is made not by demigods, but by people. Real people. People who bleed, fear, cry, and still charge forward. And that's why Minka matters. She isn't just the hero of a few battles. She's the embodiment of every soldier the Imperium throws into the fire and expects not to flinch. Her legacy isn't inscribed on golden walls or whispered in the halls of Terra. It's scratched into the trench walls of ruined worlds and etched in the hearts of guardsmen who remember what it means to fight, not because you were made for it, but because there is no one else left to do it. So let's walk through this story together, not as an exaltation, but as a reckoning. Because the path from nobody to hero isn't a clean, shining road. It's blood-soaked, ragged, and paved with the bodies of everyone who didn't make it. And Minka Lesk? She walked it alone. Before Minka Lesk ever held a lasgun or shouted orders across a battlefield, she was a child of Cadia. And that simple fact alone carries a kind of cultural weight that few outside the fortress world could ever fully grasp. Being Cadian wasn't just about where you were born, it was about who you were expected to become. You didn't just inherit a name, you inherited a war. You were born into an unending siege, where even the skies were scarred by the eye of terror, and the sound of drills was as natural as your own heartbeat. Minka didn't grow up with stories of fairy tales or legends. She grew up with unit formations, tactical exercises, and casualty reports read out like bedtime stories. Her family, like nearly every family on Cadia, was bound to the guard. Her father was a line officer, nothing flashy, just dependable. The kind of man who knew the difference between bravery and recklessness, and who taught his daughter that sometimes courage was just getting up again after you've been knocked down. Her mother had once been a Vox operator, and though she retired from active duty, she never left behind the discipline. Their home wasn't cold or cruel, but it was precise. Minka learned to make her bed sharp enough to pass inspection before she could even spell her own name. Pride didn't come from words. It came from posture, clarity, and the ability to shut up and do what needed to be done. Among the children of Cadia, there was no such thing as a carefree youth. From the earliest age, they were trained, not simply to fight, but to understand that they would have to. Every park was flanked by a training field. Every celebration carried a moment of silence for the fallen. Kids played soldier, not as a game, but as rehearsal. And Minka, even back then, was observant. She wasn't the loudest or the boldest. She didn't crave attention or medals, but she watched and she listened. She saw how the older Whiteshields returned home too quiet or didn't return at all. She memorized the nameplates at the local shrine like they were family. She wasn't being prepared for war. She was being conditioned to expect it. The pressure of being born on Cadia was generational. It wasn't just the children who carried it, it was in the blood. There was a kind of grim pride in knowing that their world stood at the edge of madness, holding the line while the rest of the Imperium slept comfortably in ignorance. And that made the Cadians bitter sometimes, but it also made them hard as iron. Minka would have absorbed this without even realizing it. She didn't grow up asking why things were the way they were. She grew up understanding that they had to be. That there was no room for softness, not when chaos was only a breath away. She wasn't famous or even remarkable during those early years. And that, in itself, is important. Because most guardsmen don't come from greatness. They come from places like Minka's neighborhood, where names are remembered because they were carved into memorials, not because they won glorious campaigns. Her path wasn't preordained. She wasn't groomed for leadership. She was a quiet girl in a city of soldiers, trying to learn how to stay alive long enough to matter. But what's interesting, and what fans have pointed out again and again, is that there was something different about her even then. Not in a flashy, chosen one kind of way. Just a kind of internal gravity. When others ran, she braced. When drills turned cruel, she endured. She didn't rebel, she didn't conform mindlessly either. She paid attention. And in a world like Cadia, where survival depended on your ability to read both terrain and people, that made her dangerous in ways no one could see yet. The mood among Cadia's youth in those final years before the fall was strange. There was a tension, an edge that never dulled. Most had grown up hearing that their world would never fall, that Cadia stood eternal. But that illusion was cracking, even before the catastrophe. Minka's generation, many of them, could feel it in the way the drills became harsher, the speeches more desperate, the eyes of their instructors darker. Something was coming. They didn't know what, but they knew it was going to be big. And though they had been raised to believe in victory, more and more of them began to understand that survival itself might soon be the only prize. Minka likely didn't talk about these fears. Most Cadians didn't, but fear has a way of shaping people even in silence. It makes them sharper, more focused, or it breaks them. Minka didn't break. She hardened, quietly, without fanfare. And when the time came to move from drills to real combat, she didn't flinch. I think that's why so many fans gravitate toward her story. She represents a kind of heroism that's rarely glorified in the Imperium. Not the burning faith of a sister of battle, not the righteous fury of a space marine, but the steady, unyielding resolve of a girl who was told she had no choice but to be a soldier, and still chose to be more. She was shaped by Cadia, no doubt, but she also became a reflection of everything Cadia meant to those who lived and died in its shadow. Before the fall, before the screams and the sky cracking open, she was just Minka, a daughter, a student, a Whiteshield recruit in waiting. But the thing is, Cadia never raised just children, it raised survivors. And Minka Lesk was already preparing for a war she couldn't even imagine yet. The fall of Cadia wasn't just another campaign. It wasn't another skirmish, another front to contain. It was the kind of event that sears itself into the collective memory of the Imperium. For most, it exists as a headline in a history text, or the subject of endless sermons about sacrifice. But for Minka Lesk, it wasn't history. It was her initiation by fire. Her violent birth into the life of a soldier, not in training exercises or theoretical drills, but in the most apocalyptic invasion the Imperium had seen in generations. And she wasn't ready. No one truly was. When the first signs came, when the skies darkened in unnatural ways and the air itself began to taste like static, there was a hush across the cities of Cadia. Not silence in the absence of sound, but the kind of stillness that comes when millions instinctively hold their breath. The Whiteshields, barely more than children in uniform, were told it was time. Time to stand where adults had once stood. Time to bleed where others had bled. They were rushed from classrooms to bunkers, from training halls to real trenches, with barely any transition. Minka was among them, last gun shaking in her hands, heart pounding with a rhythm that matched the distant thunder of orbital artillery. One of the most heartbreaking things that fan discussions always circle back to is how many Whiteshields were deployed without even completing their basic combat rotation. It was desperation, pure and brutal. The Cadian High Command knew they needed every body on the line. And to Cadia's credit, even those Whiteshields didn't hesitate. They moved forward, not because they didn't fear death, but because they had been trained their entire lives to accept it. Minka Lesk stepped into that horror like thousands of others. But unlike most, she lived to remember it. The initial chaos was unthinkable. Waves of traitor legions, demonic incursions, artillery strikes from orbit. The ground quaked with every impact. The sky bled violet and gold. Cadians fought with discipline, with fury, but they were being crushed by an enemy that broke all the rules. And there, in the middle of it all, were the Whiteshields, Minka among them, trying to hold a perimeter, trying not to panic as their instructors died beside them. You can read a dozen reports about the fall, but nothing hits harder than remembering that Minka was only a teenager, crouched in a crater, lasgun nearly fused from overheating, whispering litanies not out of piety, but to keep herself from breaking apart. She didn't become a hero that day. That's important to understand. She didn't rally troops or perform a miracle. She survived. That was her first and only victory. She held her sector long enough for retreat orders to be issued. She dragged a wounded comrade, some say it was her squad leader, others think it was a fellow Whiteshield, through collapsed rubble and out of a kill zone. She fired her last charge pack at a heretic Astartes, knowing full well it wouldn't stop him, but trying anyway. And when the order came to fall back, she didn't freeze. She ran. She ran through fire, through smoke, through the screams of dying friends. And she kept running until she reached the next fallback point, where someone handed her a new lasgun and told her to hold again. Many fans debate whether that moment, her survival in the hellfire of Cadia's final hours, is what truly made her who she became. Some argue that she was already set on that path by her upbringing, but others, myself included, believe that something inside her cracked open during that siege. Not in a way that broke her, but in a way that forced her to become someone else. The Minka Lesk who came out of Cadia's death throes wasn't the same person who went in. That girl had expectations, a plan, maybe even hope. The one who crawled from the ashes had none of that left, only a burning sense that something had been stolen from her and that she would never forgive the galaxy for it. There's something cruel about how the Imperium handles survivors. They're not honored with peace or comfort. They're weaponized. The fact that Minka lived made her valuable. A living Whiteshield from Cadia? That was rare. That was symbolic. She wasn't given time to grieve or process or even sleep properly. She was redeployed almost immediately, slotted into another regiment like a cog into a machine. And the terrifying thing is, she didn't resist. Because what else was there? Cadia was gone. Her family, unconfirmed. Her home, a crater. She had nothing to go back to. So forward was the only direction left. The trauma of that event is something that lives in every glance she gives, every command she issues later in her career. There's a haunted edge to her that fans always pick up on. She doesn't romanticize battle, she doesn't revel in victory. She remembers the screaming, the dust, the way the void tore through everything she ever loved. And that memory, ironically, became her anchor. While others fought for the Emperor or glory or vengeance, Minka fought for the dead. For those Whiteshields who never got their second breath. For the parents who vanished beneath rubble. For Cadia, not the world, but the idea. It's easy to forget how young she was. The legends and fan art often depict her as this hardened, almost mythic figure. But in those early days, she was still so close to childhood. And yet, because of what she endured, she became something else. Not a saint, not a martyr, but a vessel of survival, pain, and a purpose that had no end. Every time she looked up at the stars, she didn't see the Emperor's light. She saw the eye of terror still bleeding across the void, and she remembered. The fall of Cadia wasn't just the end of a world. It was the beginning of Minka Lesk. Not the trained soldier, not the symbol, but the survivor. The one who crawled through fire and came out the other side, fists clenched, breath ragged, eyes wide open. That's where her story truly begins. Minka Lesk's first real battle after the fall of Cadia wasn't some glorious counterattack or a dramatic moment carved into the annals of Imperial propaganda. It was messy, confused, and painfully small. Just a skirmish on a nameless world, a footnote in a larger campaign. But for her, it was everything. The first time she pulled a trigger not in training, but with the full intent to kill. The first time she saw someone fall and realized it was by her hand. The first time command was thrust on her shoulders because no one else was left to take it. It wasn't heroic. It was horrifying. The remnants of her regiment, a patchwork of survivors from different Cadian units, had barely been stitched into coherence. The commanding officers were overworked and under-equipped, and many of the senior sergeants had died in the earlier phases of redeployment. In the confusion, decisions had to be made fast. That's how Minka, barely considered more than a Whiteshield by most, found herself put in charge of a fire team during a sudden enemy ambush. Not because she was trained for it, but because the alternative was silence. Her first kill came in that same ambush. A chaos cultist, half-naked, screaming litanies to a god Minka didn't understand. He broke through the line, raised a jagged blade, and she fired. The las bolt hit center mass. He collapsed, twitching. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even process it at first. What stuck with her wasn't the kill. It was the face. The expression of someone who genuinely believed they were doing something holy. Something necessary. And for the first time, Minka understood how terrifying belief could be. She didn't sleep that night. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear of death, but from the reality of what she'd done. Training simulations don't prepare you for the smell, the sounds, or the sudden silence after. She'd grown up with the idea that killing was part of survival, that it was necessary, but no one talked about the moment after. The moment you realize that you've crossed a threshold that you can't come back from. Many fans have speculated that this first taste of blood is what broke the last piece of Minka's childhood. Not the fall of Cadia, not the loss of her family, but the act of killing with intent. Because up until then, she had always been reacting, defending, surviving, enduring. But that kill was a choice. A necessity, yes, but still a choice. And in making it, she crossed into the world of the Guard. Not just as a body, but as a mind molded by war. After the firefight, when Command learned she had taken charge and held the line, however briefly, they promoted her. Nothing formal. Just a nod, a different assignment, a slight shift in how she was treated. It wasn't recognition, it was utility. She had proven she could be useful, and in the Guard, that was currency. She didn't refuse it, she didn't protest. But deep inside, something hardened, not pride, not confidence. Just a quiet resignation. This is the part of her story that resonates so deeply with fans who've served in real-life combat or know what it means to carry responsibility in chaos. That moment when you're suddenly the one others look to, not because you're the strongest, but because you're still standing. And when Minka took command of that small fire team, she wasn't sure what she was doing. She just knew they couldn't afford to freeze. So she moved, she gave orders, and they listened. That was the beginning of her transformation, not into a hero, but into someone others depended on. What's fascinating is how this internal fracture, the loss of innocence, the collision of childhood with combat, never really healed. Even in later moments of her career, Minka often reflects back on that first kill. Not with regret, exactly, but with clarity. She remembers it not as a turning point, but as a scar. One of many. The beginning of a long, bitter education. And that's what makes her different from other heroes in the Imperium. She doesn't mask the pain with righteousness. She doesn't use duty as a shield against feeling. She knows exactly what she's doing. She knows what it costs, and she chooses to bear it anyway. That's not something taught. That's something born from fire. Her squad began to trust her, not because she gave great speeches or acted like a leader, but because she never asked others to do what she wouldn't. She took point. She carried the wounded. She dug trenches with the same exhaustion as everyone else. Her authority didn't come from rank, it came from presence. And presence in the Guard is everything. Especially when you're barely more than a kid in a field of corpses, trying to pretend you know what you're doing. There's a theory among some fans that Minka could have walked away, that if she'd faked an injury or refused promotion, she might have been rotated out, maybe sent to rear command or logistics. But that was never really an option for her, not because of pride, but because of guilt. She felt responsible for those who didn't make it. And responsibility, once it takes root, doesn't let go. Especially not for a Cadian. Her first command wasn't a glorious banner charge or a last stand against impossible odds. It was a muddy trench, a broken comm line, and a handful of terrified soldiers looking for direction. And Minka gave it, even though her voice cracked, even though she was just as scared. That's leadership in the Guard. That's how it begins. Not with medals, but with the choice to stand up when everyone else is on the ground. That fire team didn't all survive. Some died in the next push, others later in the campaign, but a few remembered her. Passed her name forward, whispered that she was one of the good ones. And in the Guard, that kind of whisper matters more than any rank insignia. It means someone held the line, not just with bullets, but with will. So when we look back at Minka's first steps as a leader, we shouldn't see them as the rise of a hero. We should see them as the death of something soft, the forging of something necessary. The moment when a Whiteshield became something else, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And from that moment on, she never looked away again. When Minka Lesk was reassigned to a regular infantry unit after her first field engagements, the change was more than just a shift in orders. It was a shift in worldviews. Up to that point, she'd been part of a shattered fragment of Cadia, surrounded mostly by other Whiteshields or survivors like herself. Young, raw, traumatized. But now she was placed among veterans, real soldiers. The kind with haunted eyes, with decades of blood soaked into their boots, with routines so ingrained they didn't flinch when the world shook. And that changed her more than she ever expected. The Guard is a brutal school, and the veterans are its most unforgiving instructors. Minka wasn't welcomed immediately. She wasn't hated either, just watched, studied, tested in quiet, unspoken ways. It wasn't about how she handled a lasgun or recited regulations. It was about whether she shut up when ordered, whether she kept her head down when artillery fell, whether she knew how to reload in the dark without fumbling. The veterans didn't care about her backstory. They cared about whether she would get them killed. And once she proved she wouldn't, something subtle shifted. She started being treated like one of them. Not with warmth, but with that particular kind of respect the Guard reserves for the competent. There were no grand speeches, no rites of passage. Just a canteen passed her way without a word. A grunt of acknowledgement when she dropped a trench knife beside a comrade too exhausted to ask. She was learning the unspoken language of soldiers who had stopped believing in survival, but fought anyway because that's all there was. What's fascinating is that in this grim, impersonal system, Minka began to find fragments of humanity again. Not in the abstract sense, not in ideals or dreams, but in the shared rhythms of soldiers trying to live through the next hour. She learned who snored the loudest, who recited scripture to their weapon like a lover, who had a family back home they never talked about unless they were drunk. These weren't bonds of friendship in the civilian sense. They were survival ties. If you bled together, you mattered to each other, even if you never said it. There's one theory among fans that this phase of her life is when she truly became a guardsman, not just in name but in soul. Not because of anything she did, but because she learned to absorb pain without letting it define her. To carry loss without breaking. To function. And it's important to understand how difficult that is. Most people think soldiers either adapt or die, but what really happens is more complicated. You become someone else. Someone who sees death as inevitable and still keeps moving. Someone who cracks jokes about ammunition shortages even as their fingers shake. One of her closest comrades during this period was a grizzled sergeant named Avon Brask, who had fought in half a dozen war zones and didn't believe in heroes. He called her kid for months, even after she outranked him. He didn't trust officers, didn't trust promises, but he trusted action. And Minka's consistency, her refusal to leave a man behind, her silence during bombardments, her unwavering aim, earned something rare from Brask: grudging approval. That was as good as love in Guard terms. Through her interactions with soldiers like Brask, she learned more than tactics. She learned restraint, the art of waiting, the patience to listen instead of rushing. She began to understand how not every battle was won with fire. Some were won by holding the line, by standing so others could fall back, by being the one who didn't blink. And those lessons stayed with her far longer than any field manual ever could. What's striking when you read through accounts of her time in that unit is how little she spoke, and how much she did. She wasn't a speech giver. She wasn't a morale booster in the traditional sense, but she was reliable. And reliability in the Guard is everything. When the Vox line went down, she got it back up. When the Flamer unit jammed, she didn't wait. She drew her blade and moved. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't celebrated, but she was there, always. And that constancy made her visible in a way that rank never could. The veterans began to look to her not because they wanted to, but because instinctively they knew she'd make the right call. She'd seen the worst, and she hadn't cracked. That made her trustworthy. Not in the sense of morality or loyalty, but in that raw, trench-level way. You knew she wouldn't panic, wouldn't run, wouldn't leave you to die if she could help it. And that kind of trust can't be taught. It's earned with blood. Another important element is how this experience reshaped Minka's understanding of command. She stopped thinking in terms of orders and began thinking in terms of people. Who could hold the line under pressure? Who needed a break but wouldn't ask for it? Who was on the edge and might snap if pushed too hard? She began to read her unit like terrain, adjusting, adapting. She stopped seeing them as numbers and started seeing them as moving parts of a machine that only worked if every piece was protected. Her time among veterans also stripped away the last vestiges of her need for validation. She no longer craved recognition. She no longer looked upward for approval. Her focus narrowed to the men and women beside her, to the mud under her boots, to the rhythm of the war zone. And in that narrowing, she found clarity. She didn't need to be a hero, she needed to keep them alive. There's something deeply poetic in how she evolved in silence, without fanfare, inside a system that rarely notices its own miracles. Minka Lesk didn't stand out because she was loud. She stood out because she kept standing. And in a world where countless guardsmen die forgotten, that's what made her unforgettable. Not her words, not even her courage, but her unbreakable presence. That's the guard way. You bleed, you bury, you move. And somehow, without ever meaning to, Minka became the kind of soldier others quietly measured themselves against. Not because she told them how to fight, but because she showed them how to endure. There's something about certain battles that doesn't just test you, it changes you. Not with glory or fanfare, but with the quiet, agonizing grind that strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself. For Minka Lesk, those moments didn't come in the largest campaigns or the bloodiest engagements. They came in battles where victory was measured in meters gained, where hope and despair lived in the same breath, and where the line between faith and madness blurred until there was nothing left to hold on to but the next step forward. One of the earliest of these crucibles was the siege of Vorgonth Delta. On paper, it was a minor holdout of Chaos cultists, but in reality, it was a nightmarish trench war waged across industrial wastelands, where every breath was laced with ash, and every shadow might be the last thing you saw. The enemy wasn't just brutal, they were fanatical. They didn't run, they didn't break. And as days turned to weeks, it became less about objectives and more about endurance. About who could hold longer before the sheer pressure of existence collapsed them. Minka led from the center, not because she sought that position, but because she refused to let others suffer alone. She took the worst rotations, she volunteered for the dead zones, and while others screamed or prayed or shut down completely, she stayed eerily calm. That kind of focus in the midst of chaos became a point of gravity for those around her. People started fighting harder just because she was there, as if her presence made the nightmare more survivable. And in a way, it did. But what fans love to talk about isn't just her stamina, it's her internal strength. The kind of strength that doesn't roar but whispers. That says, "I'm not dead yet," over and over again like a mantra. It's easy to admire the soldier who charges a bunker or waves a flag. It's harder to understand the one who drags themselves through sludge with a shattered rib, face blank, eyes focused, because stopping simply isn't an option. Minka wasn't fire. She was stone. Another turning point came during the Battle of Helia's Reach, a prolonged defensive action that saw her unit outnumbered 5-1, dug into a decaying manufactorum as wave after wave of heretics threw themselves against the walls. What started as organized defense quickly devolved into madness. Vox lines failed, reinforcements never came. The guard, as it often does, was left to die where they stood. And Minka? She didn't retreat. She moved room to room, stabilizing defenses, patching wounds, reassigning fallen leadership roles without hesitation. And when the walls finally cracked, when the enemy poured in and everything began to unravel, it wasn't orders that kept the guardsmen fighting. It was her. Not because she promised survival, but because she kept showing up. Covered in blood, face hollow, still holding the line. There's something almost mythic a dramatic way, but not. It's quieter, colder. Like watching someone be consumed from the inside out and still refuse to fall. Faith plays a strange role in moments like that. Not religious faith, not in the Emperor, not in destiny, but faith in one another. In the person beside you. In the belief that if they're still fighting, you can too. Minka embodied that, and not in a scripted Saint Celestine kind of way. She didn't float or shine, she bled, she coughed up smoke, she screamed at the wall as she jammed another power pack into her rifle. She looked like everyone else, except she never stopped. And that mattered more than any sermon. It's during these battles that guardsmen often transform. They stop being survivors and become something else. Something unyielding. It's not that the pain or fear goes away, it's that it becomes irrelevant. Fans often say that Minka isn't just a soldier, she's a crucible. A place where fear, exhaustion, and trauma are poured in and something harder comes out. Not purer, not cleaner. Just harder. Her presence became symbolic of that transformation. There are written accounts from survivors of Helia's Reach that speak about her in hushed tones, not because she saved everyone, but because she refused to let anyone die alone. One trooper recalled how she held his hand as he bled out, whispering his name over and over, even while being shelled from above. That kind of empathy in the middle of war, it doesn't make sense. But it makes people want to fight harder. And that's power the Imperium can't replicate in factories or sermons. Despair, too, becomes a character in these moments. It seeps in like mold, fills your boots and lungs. But watching someone resist it, truly resist it, not through bravado, but through sheer will, that does something to people. Minka didn't fight because she believed they would win. She fought because giving up wasn't allowed. Not on her watch. And somehow, that was enough to push others through the worst nights. One thing fans always debate is whether she actually believed in anything. In the Emperor, in Cadia, in justice. But the truth is, she didn't need to. She believed in the person next to her. In the work, in the moment. And that stripped-down, battlefield-born faith. Faith in the now, in the next breath, in the person dragging you from fire, is more real than any dogma. That's what defines the eye of the storm in Minka's story. Not the massive explosions or the number of kills, but the internal battles, where every second tests your resolve and you either break or you become something the enemy can't destroy. She became that. Not perfect, not untouched, but something more than human, forged entirely from choice and refusal. So when people talk about her strength, they often get it wrong. They think it's about killing, about leadership, but really it's about resistance, about holding on when there's nothing left to hold, about becoming the storm, not by lashing out, but by enduring everything it throws at you, and standing anyway. Leadership in the Astra Militarum is rarely earned through ceremony or choice. It doesn't arrive with medals or grand titles. More often than not, it happens in the silence after someone else falls. That's how it came to Minka Lesk. One moment she was part of the machine, another cog in the vast, grinding gears of war. The next, the people around her were looking to her for orders, not because she asked for that responsibility, but because there was no one else left to give it. Her rise through the ranks wasn't marked by ambition. In fact, one of the things that fans admire most about her is how reluctant she was to lead. She never craved command. She never saw herself as the kind of figure who would be remembered in regimental hymns. But war doesn't care what you want. It cares about whether you move when others freeze, whether you pick up the Vox when the officer's head is gone, whether you draw the map in the dirt when no one else can stop shaking long enough to hold the stick. That was Minka's promotion. Blood-slicked, unsanctioned, born in a bunker where the lights kept flickering and half the squad was down. She started giving orders not because she was certain, but because silence was worse. Because waiting would kill more of them than bad choices would. And somehow, even in that terror, her instincts were right more often than not. She learned that quickly. Command isn't about being right. It's about being clear, being fast, being something solid that others can orient themselves around. What changed in her wasn't visible at first. She still fought alongside her squad. She still took the worst shifts. But there was a shift in her posture, in the way she scanned the field, not just for threats, but for faltering morale, for cracks in the line, for the ones who were about to break. That awareness is what separates a leader from a fighter. And it's something the Guard doesn't teach. You either develop it, or you die, and take your unit with you. The first time she had to send someone to die, really send them, not as part of a general push, but in a calculated move to hold a collapsing flank, it nearly broke her. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, but she stood there for a long time after, holding her own breath, replaying the moment over and over in her head. She'd made the right call. She'd saved 20 lives by sacrificing 5. But those 5 had names, faces. One of them had made her laugh 2 nights earlier, telling a joke about ration bars and crack grenades. Now he was gone because she'd sent him. And that's the cost, that's the weight, it accumulates. Not all at once, but like sand in your boots, grain by grain, until every step feels heavier than the last. Minka carried that weight differently from most. She didn't bury it. She didn't drink it away or shout it into the void. She kept it close, almost like a ledger, a record of what her choices cost. Some fans think that's what made her a great commander, not her courage, not her tactics, but her memory. She never let herself forget who paid the price. There's a quote from a survivor of the battle at Turan Fields, an artillery officer who was briefly reassigned under her command. He said, "Lesk didn't bark, she didn't threaten, she just looked you in the eye and told you the truth. And somehow, that made you want to stand straighter." That says everything. She didn't lead through fear or charisma. She led through presence, through honesty, through sheer, relentless consistency. But leadership isn't just about managing people, it's also about bearing their ghosts. After every engagement, Minka made it a point to walk the battlefield, not just for wounded, but for herself, to see the cost, to etch it into her bones. And she never let her squad forget what they were fighting for. Not Cadia, not revenge, not the Emperor, but each other, the living, breathing people in the trench beside you. That belief wasn't taught to her. It was formed in fire and kept alive through pain. And she made mistakes. Of course she did. No leader in the Guard survives without making calls that go wrong. She once overextended a patrol line thinking it was safe. It wasn't. 3 died. 1 more was captured and found days later with symbols carved into his skin. Minka didn't deflect blame. She didn't justify. She stood in front of the squad and said, "That was on me." And that act alone did more to cement loyalty than any amount of success ever could. What's interesting is that her leadership style began to ripple outward. Other squads, other officers started to notice her. Not because she climbed ranks quickly, but because soldiers under her command didn't crack as easily. They held longer, thought harder, died less. Her calm was infectious. Her judgment, while human, was rarely clouded. And in the Guard, where chaos rules and clarity is rare, that made her invaluable. There's a kind of superstition that built up around her during those campaigns. A belief that if you were assigned under Lesk, you had a better chance of making it home. Not because of divine blessing, but because she gave a damn. And in an army that often treats its troops like numbers on a page, that simple fact became almost mythic. She became more than just a leader. She became an anchor. And yet, she never acted like she deserved that status. That humility, that refusal to accept the myth around her, only deepened the respect. Some fans think she carried guilt about surviving Cadia and everything after. That maybe part of her drive came from a need to earn the life she hadn't expected to keep. Whether that's true or not, it's clear she never saw herself as untouchable. She bled, she failed, but she never stopped showing up. So when we talk about Minka Lesk's leadership, we need to strip away the legend and look at what it really meant. It meant choosing who lived and who died. It meant waking up every day with the knowledge that someone was going to fall, and trying your damnedest to make sure it wasn't everyone. It meant being the voice in the trenches that said, "We're not done yet," even when you didn't believe it yourself. And that, more than anything, is what turned her from a soldier into something greater. Not a saint, not a hero, but a commander, one of the best the Guard has ever known. There's a strange kind of irony to how the Imperium creates its heroes. Most of them never get a say in it. One day they're just soldiers, commanders, survivors, and the next, Their names are being broadcast across a dozen systems as symbols of faith and duty. That's exactly what happened to Minka Lesk. One moment, she was holding the line on a forgotten battlefield, and the next, her face was plastered on recruitment banners. A survivor of Cadia, the last Whiteshield, a living icon of Imperial resilience. But behind that carefully lit image was someone far more complicated, far more real. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started with whispers, like most myths do. Stories about the girl who held back demons with a broken lasgun, about the young officer who dragged a burning squadmate out of a collapsing hive, about the commander who hadn't lost a single trooper in her last deployment. Half of it wasn't even true. But the thing about the Guard is that stories spread faster than orders. And in a galaxy drowning in despair, people needed something, someone to believe in. The Departamento Munitorum saw that spark and did what it always does. It fanned it into flame. Minka Lesk was perfect. She was young, scarred, visibly human. No augmentics, no divine blessings, just grit and discipline. She could be anyone, and that made her everyone's hope. Suddenly, her name was showing up in voxcasts, her likeness drawn onto the sides of Chimera transports, stylized and reimagined, always a bit cleaner, a bit more noble than she really was. She didn't ask for any of it, and from what we know, she wasn't comfortable with it either. There's a common belief among fans that she hated the attention, not because of vanity, but because she knew how many others had died for her to even be noticed. She wasn't the only survivor of Cadia. She wasn't the only one holding the line in the mud, but she became the face, and that sat heavy on her shoulders in ways few would ever understand. And that's where the fracture began. Because while the Imperium praised her as a model of faith and obedience, the truth is, Minka's strength didn't come from blind loyalty. It came from something much more raw: anger, grief, memory. She didn't fight for the Emperor. She fought for the dead, for Cadia, for the people who bled out in her arms when the sky cracked open. The propaganda machine painted her as a holy instrument of Imperial will. But she was never anyone's instrument. She was a weapon she forged herself, out of the ashes of her homeworld. What makes her story so haunting is how much of it was rewritten while she was still alive. Field reports altered, victories exaggerated, failures ignored. Speeches she never gave were attributed to her, and through it all she kept fighting, because that's what soldiers do. But there had to be moments, quiet ones between deployments, where she wondered who people were really cheering for. Her? Or the symbol they'd made of her. It's not hard to find fan theories that dig into this tension. Some even suggest she sabotaged some of the propaganda efforts, refused to attend voxcasts, declined parades, kept her distance from high command unless necessary. Others think she simply endured it the way she endured everything else, adding it to the ever-growing list of burdens she carried in silence. But there's one widely accepted truth. The image of Minka Lesk, hero of the Guard, only told half the story. And the half it left out was the most human part of her. The quiet ways she mourned. The names she whispered in her sleep. The journal entries she supposedly kept, never published, but rumored to be filled with the kind of raw truth that would never make it past the censors. That's the Minka fans talk about in private. Not the poster child, but the woman behind the gun. The one who questioned herself, who doubted, who struggled, who got back up anyway. Her myth grew even faster when other regiments began invoking her name. "Do it for Lesk" became a phrase whispered among fresh recruits, half joke, half prayer. She became the measuring stick for courage. Not because she was infallible, but because she wasn't. Because she bled like everyone else and still stood tall. And that, perhaps more than any sanctioned hero, gave people something real to hold on to. It's easy to fall in love with the idea of Minka Lesk, the last Whiteshield, the Cadian who never broke, the woman who stood in the shadow of the Emperor and somehow cast her own. But if we only look at that image, we miss what makes her powerful. It's not the medals, not the honors, it's the moments she kept going when there was no reason to. The orders she gave, knowing they'd cost lives. The countless times she chose action over despair, again and again, because she knew no one else would. Some fans believe that the reason she became such a potent symbol is because, deep down, everyone knew she didn't want to be one. That made her real, made her honest. She didn't wear righteousness like armor. She wore it like a scar, visible, painful, earned. And in the Imperium, where truth is a dangerous thing, that made her both revered and feared. Because if someone like her could become a hero without ever asking to be, it meant the rest of them, every broken guardsman in every trench across a million worlds, could be something more too. Not saints, not legends, but survivors who mattered. That's the weight of being Minka Lesk. Not just living through hell, but becoming a symbol of how to walk through it without letting it consume you. Of holding your ground not because you believe you'll win, but because someone has to. Because if you don't, who will? Cadia stands. It's a phrase that echoes across the Imperium like a prayer, like defiance, like grief that refuses to fade. It's painted on helmets, scratched into trench walls, whispered in the dark before charges. For most, it's just a symbol, a shout into the void, a stubborn refusal to forget. But for Minka Lesk, it was something else. It wasn't just memory, it was oath, it was identity, and it was her reason to keep breathing when everything else had already burned. She never let Cadia go. Not when her boots left its broken surface. Not when the brass tried to define her as something more than just a survivor. Not even when entire regiments moved on, reassigned, redrafted, their insignias changed to serve a broader campaign. Minka refused, not loudly, not with protest, but with a quiet, immovable force. She carried Cadia in her voice, her scars, her orders. Every action she took, every battlefield she stepped onto afterward was done with that shattered world pulsing just behind her eyes. But she didn't preserve Cadia by clinging to its ruins. She preserved it by transforming its fall into something unbreakable. That's the part that gets missed sometimes. Cadia's physical destruction was absolute. Continent-wide fissures, atmospheric collapse, total loss. But what survived was worse than ruins. What survived was the knowledge that they stood, they fought, and they only fell when the laws of reality bent to break them. That's not a defeat. That's legacy. And Minka became the vessel for it. Her role in preserving the spirit of Cadia wasn't about speeches or rallies. It was about discipline. About maintaining the old formations even when the new units didn't understand them. About teaching newer recruits the cadence of Cadian march drills. About honoring the fallen not with ceremony, but with action. She made it clear that Cadia was not a location. It was a standard, and any guardsman could carry it as long as they understood what it meant to stand even when everything else collapsed. There's a powerful fan theory that Minka herself never really believed Cadia had fallen. Not in the way people mean when they talk about planetary destruction. The crust was gone, yes, the defenses were shattered, but the people, the doctrine, the will, that still burned. And as long as that flame existed in even one survivor, Cadia stood. That's what she meant every time she said those words, not as denial, but as defiance. During one particular campaign on Barrows Prime, after a grueling month-long siege, she rallied a battered unit by stepping into the middle of the trench line, arms covered in blood, and simply stating, "Cadia stands." That was it. No rousing speech, no demand, just those two words. And it broke something loose in them. These weren't Cadians, they were a mixed group of Valhallans and newly raised conscripts from Carthos. But in that moment, they understood what it meant. That you don't have to win to matter, you just have to keep fighting, keep holding. And that's the heart of the phrase. Cadia stands isn't about geography, it's not about orbital stations or fortress bastions. It's about the refusal to be erased, to be forgotten. Minka carried that spirit into every battle. When morale was lowest, when death felt inevitable, she would invoke Cadia not as nostalgia, but as expectation. It was her way of saying, look around, we're still here. And if we're still here, then Cadia is too. Some Imperial commanders tried to shape this into a neat recruitment campaign. They wanted to mold her into a martyr, the symbol of noble sacrifice. But she never played along. In private, she reminded her squads that Cadia wasn't about dying well. It was about fighting like hell so someone else didn't have to. She redefined what honor meant in the Guard. Not medals, not glory, but making it out so the story could be told again. Louder, truer. Her refusal to let Cadia die extended to the way she trained new soldiers. She kept the tactical sharpness, the precision shooting drills, the refusal to retreat unless it was tactically sound. She enforced discipline, not for the sake of obedience, but because she knew what happened when it slipped. She saw how Cadia fell. bit by bit when lines broke under pressure. She wasn't going to let that happen again. So she rebuilt it, in squads, in drills, in memory. The moment that really sealed her place as Cadia's living legacy was on Oraton Ridge. Mid-battle, outnumbered, pinned against a wall of heretic engines, and with Vox communications cut off, she planted a Cadian banner in the mud. Not a fresh one. It was scorched, torn, barely held together. She had carried it through 4 deployments. She planted it not for victory, but for memory. The squad rallied around it, fought back, and when reinforcements finally arrived, that tattered banner was the only color still flying in the smoke. That image became iconic, not because it was beautiful, but because it was real. That's Minka Lesk, worn, scarred, standing anyway. That's Cadia. Fans often say that she didn't just survive Cadia's fall, she revived its soul. Not by rewriting history, but by making damn sure the galaxy never forgot who they were. That every guardsman, every citizen, every enemy knew that you can destroy a planet, but you can't kill an idea once it's burned into enough hearts. And that's what she became. A walking reminder that strength doesn't come from walls or weapons. It comes from standing, bleeding, refusing to fall when every logical reason says you should. She didn't carry Cadia's name. She carried its meaning. Its pain, its defiance. Cadia stands. For her, those words weren't a slogan, they were a promise. And every time she whispered them, into the comms to a dying comrade, or just under her breath as she stepped into the next hell, they echoed louder than any battle cry. They weren't for her. They were for everyone who needed to believe that something unbreakable still existed. There's a reason why, out of the countless billions who've worn the flak armor of the Astra Militarum, Minka Lesk became something more than a name in a casualty report. It's not because she won wars single-handedly. It's not because she commanded thousands or uncovered galaxy-shifting secrets. It's because she reflected exactly what the Guard truly is. Not the idealized version, not the propaganda, but the real blood-and-mud truth. Her story isn't just her own. It's the story of every guardsman who ever picked up a las gun and wondered if they'd see the next sunrise. She didn't rise from greatness. She wasn't gifted. She didn't have divine visions or forbidden knowledge. She started at the bottom, as low as you could get, a Whiteshield in a crumbling world. And what followed wasn't a miraculous ascent. It was a crawl, inch by inch through grief, failure, exhaustion, and fire. That's the Guard experience. You survive long enough to be noticed, you bleed long enough to be promoted, and if you're unlucky, they start expecting you to win. Minka survived, not because she was better, but because she refused to die. That's the thing fans always come back to. A refusal. When others gave in, when the lines broke, when the skies lit up with heresy and the earth itself turned against them, she stood, not with a speech, not with glory, just with a clenched jaw and a finger on the trigger. She never became something more than human. She stayed exactly that, and that made her the perfect mirror. Because the Guard isn't about heroics, it's about endurance. And she endured everything the galaxy could throw at her. There's a common saying among troopers, the Guard doesn't break, it absorbs. That's Minka to the core. She absorbed loss, pain, expectation. She absorbed the myth that Cadia was unbreakable, then the truth that it wasn't, and then the responsibility to carry on anyway. She carried other people's grief, their hopes, their fear, and she never pretended to be untouched by it. She just carried it better than most. And that's where the connection with other guardsmen becomes so personal. Because when they look at her, they don't see a saint. They see themselves, pushed a little further. They see someone who made the same mistakes, who lost the same friends, who held the same lines, and who didn't crumble. She's proof that the Guard doesn't have to be a faceless machine, that it can mean something more than dying for the Emperor, that it can be about holding the person next to you upright when they're too tired to keep going. A lot of fans talk about the emotional realism of her story, how she embodies fear, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind you carry with you like an old injury. The kind that reminds you to keep your head down during a barrage, to double-check the door before you breach, to whisper a name before you shoot. She didn't pretend she was fearless, and that made her stronger than most who claimed they were. She also reflected something else rarely spoken about in the Guard: hope. Not the shiny, high Gothic kind, the dirty, wounded kind. the kind that limps. Hope that maybe the next generation of recruits won't have to go through quite the same hell. Hope that the stories of the dead will mean something, that the fallen won't be just numbers, that even in the grinding nightmare of endless war, something worth remembering still exists. Her presence made other soldiers hold themselves straighter, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. She fought like they did, suffered like they did, and yet kept moving forward. In the Guard, that kind of leadership isn't taught, it's recognized. Passed on not through orders, but through glances, nods, and the way a squad instinctively closes ranks around someone they trust. There's something deeply grounding about how she carried the contradictions of the Astra Militarum. She knew what the Guard was, cannon fodder, disposable, forgotten. But she also knew what it could be: brotherhood, duty, meaning carved out of chaos. She didn't deny the horrors, she just didn't let them be the whole story. And that balance between despair and determination is what defines the Guard better than any regimental anthem. Even her silence became a reflection of the Guard's soul. She wasn't verbose. She didn't narrate her thoughts or seek the spotlight. She led by doing, by being there, by shouldering burdens no one else wanted. Her stillness in the middle of chaos was its own kind of message, and it spoke louder than any Vox transmission. Some fans say she was the last real Guardsman, not because no one followed her example, but because the Imperium has a habit of destroying its best and hollowing out their stories for comfort. But others believe she lit a fuse that's still burning, that her way of fighting, quiet, unshakable, human, lives on in thousands of unremarked soldiers across the stars. That every time a trooper grips their weapon a little tighter, every time a squad leader stands a little taller, they're reflecting her without even realizing it. And that's what a mirror does. It doesn't invent, it shows you what's already there. Minka Lesk didn't create courage in the Guard. She revealed it. She didn't invent endurance. She modeled it. She didn't teach hope. She reminded us it hadn't died. So when people ask why she matters, why her story gets told again and again, even though she never became a Lord General or ascended to sainthood, the answer is simple: she was us. Every Guardsman who fought and bled and never got named. She gave us our reflection. And in a galaxy that chews up everything human and spits out only myth, that's more precious than any relic. That's why we remember her. Because in her, we remember ourselves. There's something strange about what happens to people like Minka Lesk. One moment, they're flesh and blood, real, bruised, breathing soldiers. And the next, they're legends. You start hearing their name not in reports but in sermons. You see their image not on patrol but painted on banners with gold trim. And before long, the line between who they were and what they represent becomes impossible to separate. That's the dilemma with Minka now. Is she still a person? Or has she become something else entirely? The official record doesn't help. It's clean, too clean. It talks about her like a paragon, heroine of Cadia, unbreakable commander, icon of the Guard. But it flattens her. It makes her sound like she was born with courage, instead of building it one terrified breath at a time. The sanctioned accounts rarely mention her moments of doubt. They don't talk about how often she hesitated, or how deeply she carried the losses of her comrades. Instead, they shape her into this perfect Imperial product. Flawless, obedient, unyielding. And maybe for the sake of morale, that's useful. But it's not the truth. Not the whole truth. Among fans and Guardsmen, the picture is far more complicated. To some, she's become a kind of spiritual successor to Sly Marbo, an untouchable figure of raw survival instinct and steel will. To others, especially those who still wear the flak and march under rusted banners, she's something softer. Not a saint, not a monster. Just a soldier who never stopped being one of them. That's the version that appears in field journals and trench wall graffiti. The version who still winces when someone says Cadia, who still lights a candle for every comrade left behind, who keeps a battered lasgun even though she could have claimed a power sword years ago. The divide between the myth and the reality is made even sharper by the differences in how she's portrayed in official novels versus how she lives in the oral traditions of the Guard. In the books, she's polished, stoic, nearly invincible. She delivers speeches that sound rehearsed, moves with perfect clarity, makes choices that always seem justified in retrospect. But if you talk to the soldiers who claim to have served near her, or at least know someone who did, they tell a different story. They talk about a woman who didn't sleep before battle, who whispered the names of her lost platoon like a prayer, who once punched a commissar for threatening to execute a trooper in shock. There's a theory that Minka herself hated what she became. Not the service, not the responsibility, but the image, the distortion. That every time she saw her face on a poster, she thought about all the faces that would never be seen again. The friends buried in nameless dirt. The soldiers forgotten by the administratum's endless scrolls. Some fans believe she even tried to disappear at one point, faked her death, or stepped down into a lower-ranked unit just to escape the weight of being her. There's no proof of that, of course, but the idea speaks to something deeper. The discomfort many feel when someone real gets turned into a symbol. Because a symbol doesn't get tired. A symbol doesn't bleed or break. A symbol can be used. And that's the risk. That the more we mythologize Minka, the more we risk erasing her. The real her. The girl who survived because she didn't know what else to do. The commander who made bad calls and lived with them. The soldier who became a leader, not by destiny, but by attrition. If we only see the ideal, we lose the lesson. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things, not because they're chosen, but because they refuse to stop. Some say she's still out there, serving in the shadows, her name stripped from the rolls, her presence kept secret so she can continue being effective instead of ceremonial. Others think she finally died, and the Imperium just didn't tell us, because to announce her death would shatter too many illusions. And then there are those who believe she's alive but broken, a relic of a war that took too much, that the cost of becoming a symbol is that you can never be human again. And honestly, all of those could be true, because what Minka Lesk reflects now isn't just a soldier's journey. It's a warning about what we do to people when we need hope, about how we raise them up so high they can't come down, about how we forget that before the medals and the murals, there was just a young woman staring at a dead planet, promising herself she wouldn't be the next to fall. What she's become depends on who's looking. To the administratum, she's a recruitment tool. To the ecclesiarchy, she's a tale of divine resilience. To the average guardsman, she's a ghost in the trenches, a reminder that someone like them once made it through. And to fans like me, she's something even harder to define. Not a hero, not a martyr. Just proof that in this cruel, uncaring galaxy, one person can matter. One story can echo. One act of survival can change everything. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the myth and the reality don't have to be at odds. Maybe the legend of Minka Lesk helps keep people alive, even if it's only partly true. Maybe that's the best we can hope for in a universe like this. A little light, even if it casts a distorted shadow. And if Minka ever hears what they say about her now, I think she'd sigh, shake her head, and keep walking. Because there's always another trench, always another name to carry, always one more reason to stand. Minka Lesk didn't set out to become anything more than a guardsman. She wasn't chasing honor, and she didn't expect recognition. She was the last Whiteshield, someone who began her life of war not in a decorated command post or an elite corps, but in the crumbling remains of a dying world with a lasgun too large for her hands and eyes still haunted by the smoke of Cadia. And yet, she walked a path that would turn her into something no one could have predicted. Not a hero in the conventional sense, but a living memory. A vessel for everything the Astra Militarum stands for. Its fear, its rage, its stubborn hope, and above all, its refusal to fall. There's something undeniably tragic in how her story arcs. She never had the luxury of peace, never the moment to step back and ask what she wanted. Her whole life was reaction, responding to death, to command, to duty again and again. But in that constant storm, she became more than a survivor. She became a mirror. Not just for the Guard, but for the very soul of the Imperium's fighting class. The millions who die unnamed, the ones buried under ice fields or forgotten in jungles no one even mapped. Through her, their voices echoed just a little louder. Because that's what she really is. Not a statue, not a symbol in the way the Imperium likes to forge its martyrs, but a presence that refuses to be erased. When soldiers invoke her name, it's not out of blind worship, it's out of understanding. They see the weight she carried, and it reminds them they can carry theirs. They see the grief in her eyes and recognize their own. They remember that she didn't lead through command, but through endurance, through standing when others couldn't, through speaking when silence was easier, through fighting when there was no hope left to cling to. And the legacy she left behind, or maybe is still leaving, is deeper than medals or stories. It's the idea that someone like her, someone who came from the dirt and never stopped tasting it, could become the heart of something as massive as the Astra Militarum. That kind of transformation isn't just inspiring, it's terrifying, because it forces us to look at ourselves and ask what we're doing with the pain we carry. Are we hiding from it, or are we turning it into something others can follow? To me, and to many fans who talk about her with the same reverence others reserve for saints, Minka Lesk represents the collective memory of every guardsman who wasn't supposed to survive. She is the fire lit by the forgotten, the face of the nameless, the quiet reminder that the Imperium doesn't stand on the strength of its primarchs or the might of its fleets, but on the broken backs and blistered hands of the Guard. And I think that's why her story sticks. Because it doesn't try to be clean. It doesn't offer a triumphant ending. It doesn't promise justice or redemption. It just shows us what it means to keep going. To keep walking forward through the blood and the smoke, carrying more names than one heart should ever bear. She's not just the last Whiteshield. She's the one who remembered every other Whiteshield that didn't make it. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. That for every battle she survived, she carried a little more weight. Not because someone told her to, but because she couldn't let herself forget. And in a galaxy that forgets so easily, where entire worlds vanish from records, where sacrifice is measured in billions, Minka remembered. That, more than anything, is what makes her more than a hero. She became memory incarnate. Not just of Cadia, but of every lost world, every lost name. Some say she's still out there. Others think she's long gone, buried somewhere quiet, with no ceremony, just as she might have wanted. Either way, the impact remains. We still whisper Cadia stands, not as defiance alone, but as a quiet oath. As if we're all trying to live just a little like she did, wounded, exhausted, but still standing. So if her story means anything to you, if it made you feel seen, or stronger, or just a little less alone in the shadow of this brutal universe, don't let it end here. Keep it moving, keep it alive. Every time you hold the line, help someone carry their pack, or whisper a name before the charge, you're carrying Minka Lesk with you. And if you want to keep walking with us through the trenches, through the myths and memories of this vast cursed Imperium, you know what to do. Subscribe, stay close, and remember, it's not about the heroes we're told to believe in. It's about the ones we quietly choose to follow. And Minka, she'll always be one of them. One of us. One of the Guard. And through her, they all still stand.